Thank you for that warm welcome. To the stage, I'd like to introduce my fellow panelists. Munyi Ndinga is the Secretary of the Association of Fintech in Kenya. So please, Munyi, join me on the stage. I'd also like to introduce Caroline Nguya. Caroline Nguya is an IP and tech lawyer practicing at KO Associates. So Caroline, please join me to the stage as well. I'd like to introduce Kevin Mutiso to the stage. Kevin is the secretary or the chairman of the Digital Lenders Association of Kenya. So Kevin, please. And finally to the stage, I'd like to introduce Carol Kokilei. Carol is the manager of the legal advisory services at PwC. So Caroline. Thank you, fellow panelists. It is indeed a pleasure to be joined by distinguished seniors in your profession from both legal and business advisory ends. And perhaps just building cadence with the theme of the summit, right? Looking at the Pan-African aspect of fintech, right? My first question to the panelists, right, and a bit controversial would be, do you see a space or a need to have a Pan-African or an African-wide regulatory regime for the fintech space, right? I'd just like to maybe pick your thoughts on that as well. Perhaps you can start with Caroline.
Thank you so much, Frank, and good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here today. To your question, straight to that, Pan-African platform, absolutely, there is room for that. I think we all know, well, we all techies here, we know that tech is borderless, right? We all have the cross-border applications, and even if you're not practicing them at the moment, they are sitting there latently. So really, the issue that we have as tech providers is then we have to go across all these jurisdictions to get approvals. So dealing with several regulators across multiple jurisdictions is really a big challenge. And also for regulators as well, having then to deal with enforcement issues and conflict of law issues across jurisdiction is really such a huge challenge. So then therein comes the regional agreements. I think a good example is the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which, as we all know, is something that is quite active and has taken quite, a big space in driving a single market framework across Africa. I think it's really a very novel thing, but the challenge that we're having across jurisdictions, not just in Africa, but across the world, is really the issue of the possessiveness of sovereignty that a lot of countries have. They don't want to let go of that sovereignty. So it then becomes a challenge to have a harmonized regulatory framework. So what really is happening in practice is some kind of regulatory coordination where you have countries implementing their domestic laws, but then coordinating across jurisdictions. So, at the end of the day, what it boils down to is collaboration. Practically what we can do as an African continent and even globally is then to ensure that we take advantage of collaborative forums like this summit, for instance, the festivals, the tech festivals, the, just forums that to, ensure we come together as a global and even Africa-wide ecosystem of fintechs.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Perhaps pivoting off from what she said, Kevin, you're an evangelist of fintechs in Kenya, right? Perhaps, how do you see this space and how do you see an opportunity here to canvass African-wide regulatory regimes, perhaps from our business perspective as well?
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I echo your sentiments, Caroline. I think the answer is yes. We should have an Africa framework. I think the opportunity through the ACFTA is a good one. I think what I can add to the conversation is, let's start by focusing on what lowest hanging fruit. One of the big challenges we have in fintech is identity, for example. How do we do KYC checks digitally? How do we confirm that Kevin Mutiso is actually Kevin Mutiso? How do we get Kevin Mutiso's credit scoring data from Uganda into Kenya and make it relevant? And what are the policies or what are the ideas that need to be around that, so that we can make those two solutions, for example, scalable, and the rest will follow. This morning, we also talked about switching. In fintech, there's a lot of disbursements, there's receiving, there's settlement, right? If we could also have a unified approach to solving for that. I feel like that would go a long way as we solve the other aspects of policy and that Africa-wide approach.
Thank you so much. Perhaps Nwunye and Caroline, do you have any contrary opinions to those postulations?
Good morning, everyone. I ideally would not say I have any contrary opinion to what my predecessor speakers have said. However, we can also pick up this conversation from the sectoral perspective. As Caroline has mentioned, that the main challenges that are perceived with the implementation of a regional framework for facilitating or creating a conducive environment, especially for FDIs and business interrelations amongst African countries, is the need to maintain sovereignty. And the fact that even within our regions, for example, East Africa region, we already have our trade agreements and consensus on how we intend to do our businesses. But you realize that moving away or migrating into the broader regional or umbrella apex of the Africa Trade Agreement becomes a challenge. So even as fintech service providers, as we're seated here, I think this is an opportunity for us to pick up the conversation based on sectoral reforms or sectoral policies that we would then take as recommendations to the umbrella body, which would then facilitate this entire process of ensuring that the trade barriers and tariffs and all that hindrances to the business environment are gradually dealt with, or we gradually move along with them.
Thank you so much. Perhaps moving on to the next question, yeah. I think the elephant in the room, or lack thereof, because we don't have a regulator in this panel, is we see regulation always trying to catch up with technology, right? Which becomes an almost impossible task, right? Giving the example of Kenya, we do see some regulators taking the aspect of regulatory sandboxes, right? However, also in the fintech space, there's still an opportunity there, right, from a regulation perspective. How do you perceive those ideas, and how do you perceive those perhaps postulations with regard to regulators' approach to having an innovative pathway for fintechs to actually take in that space?
If I may,
you can go ahead, yeah.
Okay. I think I'll take it. I guess the mic is on me. So, I mean, with regards to the sandbox approach of regulation, we all appreciate here that we are in different forms of businesses. There could be the banking businesses, we could be in the business of insurance, we could be in the digital lending business. So we appreciate that the regulatory framework, especially speaking from the Kenyan environment, is diverse and is mostly very cut out to meet particular market needs depending on the sector. So, I mean, fintechs are deliberating the approach of having one sandbox or a sort of group approach to regulation would then mean that there's a lot of collaboration from the different industry or service providers. So it's in my opinion, it would be something that would be workable, but in the very, very, very long-term perspective, because marrying the objectives of the different industry players and the regulatory framework, for example, for CBK, it's a whole different set of regulations for insurance companies and for the banking sector, even though the intended objectives will be the same. But then again, if I may add, some of these regulations are really a repetition of what is already there. For example, the CBK regulations for digital lenders provides for issues of consumer protection, data protection, and other compliance or reporting mechanisms that are already embedded in other laws. For example, we have the Consumer Protection Act, we have the Data Protection Act, we have the Banking Act, and all of these are already embedded in the existing laws. So it is a conversation that we can always pick up to see if we can come to a common point of convergence.
Thank you. Perhaps, Muni, you're an active player in the market, right?
Yep.
So is there a fostered approach from all fintech players, perhaps to explore sandboxes, right, with the regulators, right, of like a fostered collaboration efforts, right? And perhaps you can give your thoughts on that and your practical experiences with those approaches as well.
Thank you. I think I'd like to look at it from both extremes. So one is what she's quite articulated well, because there's already existing regulation and policies around different industries. And at times we need to accept what is actually already hard-coded and not spend too much time trying to change what is hard-coded, but look at what opportunities are there in the market. So today we've got regulation that exists in banking, insurance, and any other financial services sector. But on this other hand, you've got an industry that is actually leveraging on technology to start now breaking all these barriers. So at times what happens is we spend a lot of time trying to change the regulation as opposed to look at what are the opportunities that these new technologies, these new collaborations can give us. And I'd like to give an example of how are we able to embed regulation in coding, for example. For those that actually do a lot of dev work, many years ago you already started embedding security in product development. So the challenge to us is how do we embed regulation in product development as well. So once you do that, then it means then that you take many aspects of what is already hard-coded in regulation and start putting it in the products that we develop. And when you look at even the challenges that the fintech community is facing, especially the startup sector, is them not being able to understand or relate with the regulations that actually govern what they do. So, but if this then starts being part of your software development cycle, part of your platform development, it then means then that it's more of a collaborative approach between the industry and the regulators in trying to make sure that, yes, we achieve a platform that allows everybody to participate, but at the same time as well, being able to satisfy the regulation requirements of a certain market.
I think, Kevin and Carol, you deal with both sides of the landscape, that is the business-facing side and the regulators as it were. Perhaps I'd like to maybe understand your pain points when you're dealing with the regulators, right? And also what your clients actually ask, right? What do our clients ask with regard to these pain points, and how do you navigate those pitfalls or potential pitfalls as well?
Yeah, sure. I think to the point on the sandboxes, we have sandboxes, in a large number of jurisdictions. The challenge that we're having is that some regulators don't have the sandboxes, or you have a situation where you've got a product that cuts across different subsectors, and so the question is, where do you go? Because there are all these regulators with their individual sandboxes. So the idea of a consolidated sandbox at the end of the day is really a good thing. Maybe I can give an example of the UK. They have the FCA regulated single sandbox, which has worked quite well in kind of ensuring that the regulator is able to easily identify the things that cut across your product and ensure that they are dealt with within that sandbox. As Munia said, we don't have to sort of do a total upheaval of the systems that we currently have. But what we can do then as regulators is come together and sort of create a framework that ensures that we have a single sandbox that cuts across all the products. Yeah.
Kevin, your thoughts on that?
The sandbox method has definitely shown that it is the better way. My take on this is what we need to focus on, echoing what Muni was saying, is how can we make it easier for the regulators to catch up? So I'm actually of the opinion that regulators should not be ahead of the technology, because their mandate is very simple. It's market conduct and stability of the market. What we need to create is a framework where we as businesses can engage the regulator in a way that doesn't undermine that mandate that they have, right? And that's where the Sandbox idea is a great one. What we also need to then focus on is how do we streamline some of the existing processes that exist in the different regulatory frameworks. For example, fit and proper. If I do fit and proper at CBK, should I do fit and proper at Bank of Uganda, Bank of Ghana, Bank of Nigeria? I think that should be standardized across the continent and across the region, so that it's easier for the fintechs to engage the marketplace, but without disrupting the mandate of the regulator. So that's sort of the way I think about this.
And perhaps just in that regard, then how do you navigate the multi-sectoral challenges as a fintech that you have? Let's say you have to comply with the consumer protection authorities, data protection authorities. Of course, it does become a huge compliance cost on your business. So how do you navigate that as well?
In fact, one of the arguments I've made is the reason tier 3 banks and microfinance banks have failed in this country is the cost of compliance is just too high. If you don't have a certain size of balance sheet, the cost of compliance is going to kill you alone, before you pay salaries and rent. So to your point, what we need to do is figure out how do we streamline what needs to be streamlined. So the easy stuff, and I've already given one, fit and proper, right? If I'm able to be a director of a bank, I should be able to be a director of an insurance company or a subsidiary of my bank in Uganda. So we need to focus on how do we make the cost of compliance easier, and how do we make the regulators see the value of that to them, because there's also a capacity issue. One of the biggest challenges, and Muni can confirm this when we were negotiating the DCP, was is there capacity at CBK to license 100 plus lenders when they've only licensed 43 banks, 14 MFIs, 17 remittance platforms. We are the biggest constituency now, right? Now, if it's going to take 2 years to get a license, that will genuinely affect how the operations of the business will be. So my take on this thing is the laws we have could be good enough for what we have, but what we need to focus on is how do we streamline some of the processes so that it's efficient for both parties.
Yeah, perhaps to Muni, of course, a regulator will come and say that, look, we need to look after market conduct. We need to protect consumers, right? So how do you achieve that balance between innovation and regulation? I think there's an opportunity here to be explored, but how do you do that from a practical perspective as well?
Yeah, traditionally, what the tech industry has been doing is, flying far away from regulation. Flying far away from the sun so you don't get burnt. Mm-hmm. And I think, that era is gone. And as we build, as we as entrepreneurs try and solve challenges in this market, we must also understand what it is that the regulator is trying to do. Mm-hmm. Because at the center of it is a customer. So the innovator, the entrepreneur sees a customer, the regulator sees a citizen. And we are all aiming to achieve the same thing. Mm-hmm. So then the question is, how often are we interfacing with the regulator, for example? And more often than not, you find that we are only interfacing either when you're renewing your license or when there's a letter that has come in that's sort of giving you a warning and you have to explain yourself. But we never actually connect and ask the regulator, how do you see yourself regulating our space in the next 5 to 10 years? What are the challenges that you're seeing that are possibly going to emerge within the space that you're operating in? So even as we innovate, we can also innovate for regulation, for example. So in a sense that if there is a way that, for example, the regulator is doing it manually, like what Kevin is asking, how do you regulate 300 digital lenders, for example? Is there a way that the digital lending business community by itself could actually build a platform that makes it easier for CBK to actually peep into and see whatever it is that they're doing and they feel comfortable? So for me, I think it's meeting each other halfway. As innovators and entrepreneurs, we can no longer continue flying too far away from regulation. It's not going anywhere. So I think there's an opportunity for us to meet halfway, and also for the regulators to listen. And this is to all of us, because what I've seen happening a lot is the noise comes after the regulation has been passed. I know we clapped after the president refused to assent to the ICT practitioners bill, but I can tell you, if we did a quick poll right now who has read that bill, I'll tell you, less than 10% of the guys in this room have read that bill, and it affects their daily bread. Yeah. Funny thing. So I think also the active public citizen participation in the process of legislation and in the process of creating these regulations goes a long way in actually inputting the things that we want to see in terms of regulation.
Thank you. Perhaps you can test the audience's appetite towards regulation by taking a couple of questions. Let's see who has actually read the ICT bill in that regard. So I would be glad to take questions from the audience. Any questions? If there are none, maybe perhaps I'd like to swing these questions to both the legal advisors in the room. Do you see an opportunity here for RegTech, right? In terms of what Muni has just said, right? There's a huge opening here for both lawyers, non-lawyers, fintech players, technology players, right? Do you see an opening for that gap in the market?
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely room for RegTech, SupTech as well. And I'd just like to pick a point on what Kevin had alluded to earlier as regards to upskilling of regulators. Really, really important for them to embrace SupTech, so that even as they're interacting with the various fintech providers, they come from a place of deep understanding of how it is that technology can change the way that we are doing things. This then gives them a nice platform for them to interact in a very open way, and to sort of look at these new technologies, not from a point of bias where we are coming from, a place like digital lenders. We had this kind of negative press and perception that there were these rogue digital lenders who were engaging in unsavory practices. But you're coming from a place where you're testing these products from just purely their merits, and so upskilling the regulator is really a key thing. I also just want to touch on national policy, which I think is quite important. It's really important for us to have some sort of integrated national policy across jurisdiction that touches on purely fintech. I know, like in Kenya at the moment, we do have an ICT policy, we have payments strategy policy, but we do not have some sort of standard fintech policy that then articulates the government's view of fintech. What is fintech? Demystifying what it is. What are the roles and obligations of the various players within the industry, and then that certainly will give a good platform so that we know, if I have this product, this is where I need to go. Yeah, there's a fintech office, this is where I can go. It's a one-stop shop. I can receive the services I need and get direction on the way forward.
Thank you. Perhaps as this wrap up, parting shots, Kevin, Caroline, Munyi, Carol.
Well, my parting shot is, maybe I should talk about the experience so far. So the digital credit provider law regulations that are due by September 17th gave us a lot of insight into how to engage government as an ICT sector. And so I think for those of us in the room, I think maybe let me share 3 or 4 deep insights. So the first insight was government is a huge machine that has several actors in it, and understanding the different actors is important because they each have very important roles they play and may have antagonistic relationship. So do not assume because the finance committee at parliament is in charge of money bills that they're working hand in hand with treasury or they're working hand in hand with CBK. That may not be the case. So assuming that that is so makes you approach the problem statement in a wrong way. So that's the first insight. The second insight is that this notion that there's an antagonistic relationship between government and industry is also wrong. Government usually just wants to understand, well, I'm over-exaggerating usually, but if you find the right people to talk to within that ecosystem, they usually just want to understand what you do, how you do it, because they're not business people. And that comes to my third insight. When you talk to economists at CBK Treasury, they've been there since they were 24 years old. Right, and today the guy is 40, 50, just hitting about retirement age. And the most usually they've done is a side hustle that is not even fintech or ICT or innovation driven. So their understanding of business is very old school. So it's zero-sum games. They expect you to. They're thinking you guys just don't want to pay taxes. Blah blah blah. So that understanding of who you're talking to is not, that they're not business people, just allows you to approach them with a little bit more empathy. And then finally, PR, right? Public opinion shapes policy in many ways. We were being hammered by the central bank on almost a daily basis. I woke up one day and the central bank governor had said digital lenders are like fleas, right? How can he say that when we impact 4 million customers on a daily basis? So yes, we're lending 4,000 shillings, which is nothing compared to what the banks are doing, but we're impacting several people in his ecosystem. So the public opinion shaping that we did over the last 2 years, where you saw adverts, PR campaigns from the digital lenders, the invention of the word rogue lender so that there's a differentiation between the two sides of the market, has really helped us get a seat at the table. And so I know Kenyans, we are very shy. I don't know why we are this shy. When you go to Nigeria, US, they're not as shy as we are. But don't fear coming on stage if you're a policy expert or an expert of any kind, where you can lend your voice to achieving a much bigger objective for the betterment of the ecosystem.
Thank you, Kevin. Perhaps we have a few seconds. Caroline, then Munyi, and final Carol.
There's so much to say and very minimal time. So, as a parting shot, or my last words would be, is regulation an opportunity for fintech service providers? Yes, it is. It depends on how you look at it. Regulation promotes competitiveness. Regulations fosters integrity in the market players. Regulation fosters trust, builds collaboration with the governments and the regulators in place. And do you have a chance as industry players to shape regulation in the way in which you want it to be, for it to be very business friendly and accommodate the business interests of the various players? Yes, that is why we have industry associations, as some of you are here. So what we need to do is adopt a very strategic policy initiative to direct the industry needs to the service provider, while still appreciating that the regulator is here to stay. So you find a way to suit it in a way that fits your business interests and also comply with the regulator or the laws in place.
Thank you so much. Munyi, Carol.
Yeah, quickly. 6 weeks ago, under the umbrella of the Fintech Association of Kenya, we did have a meeting with the central bank governor. And just two things came to mind of what he said is, one, standards. How can we collaborate in creating standards within the fintech industry? That was a challenge that was thrown to us. And then the other one is impact. The challenge that we're having today is we've got a lot of announcements about how much has been invested in fintechs. But we're not having a conversation about how much impact the fintechs are having in the economy in terms of transforming different industries. And this is one of the ways that you start connecting with government, when you start speaking to impact and the things that you're actually doing in the market. So for me, I think standards and impact things are a challenge to us to be able to address that.
Thank you. Finally, Carol.
Yeah, thanks. Just quickly, we have a huge unemployment gap in Africa. Fintech is going to be really important for us to bridge that gap, as well as promote financial inclusion. So it really is incumbent on us as an ecosystem of fintechs, regulators working together with the fintech players to collaboratively come up with ways to reduce the market entry barriers that are currently existing.
Thank you. I think, in perspective, so streamline collaboration, Pan-African integrity, and also, impact as well. So I think that's a parting shot for our 4 panelists. I'd like to thank Carol, Muni, Caroline, and Kevin, and very elaborate and shared perspectives in this discussion. So thank you so much. And to the audience as well, thank you for your time and for listening to us. So thank you as well.